Hey y'all, I'm Alan with PERC Coffee, and today PERC does science. So we've got here is a standard V60 setup and some ground Brazilian coffee. And what we're gonna do is figure out what the effect of different levels of preheating your filter cone have on the extraction of coffee, how much of the coffee makes it into the cup. So we're just gonna preheat it a little bit on this first trial. We're in Savannah, Georgia, so it's already 90 degrees outside. So the cone's got a little bit of heat to it, but it's ceramic. And ceramic has a tendency to take a long time to heat up, but then it also preserves heat really, really well. So that looked about how we would normally preheat a filter cone. And we're gonna find out what the temperature of the brew is, and then also just how much of that makes it into the cup. So we're starting with a dose of 20 grams, and we're gonna do these brews absolutely identically, and that way we make sure we're doing a fair comparison. And we're just gonna do a very simple standard brew. Got our bloom, a little bit of agitation. So right now we're using just good filtered water, and it's set to 206 degrees. Our kettle, will hold it there during the entire brew process, and we'll make sure that that's even across both brews. Something that we're gonna find though is that even though we're using water that's well over 200 degrees, the brew temperature is not gonna be anywhere near 200 degrees. And that's just the result of the filter cone pulling away some of the heat and then the air taking some of it. It'd be more if you live someplace a little cooler than Savannah. So as we dilute it here, once we fill up the filter cone, we'll take a temperature reading of the slurry. We'll see how hot it is at the beginning and then how hot it is again towards the end of the brew. We're gonna dilute with 340 grams of water. That's for two reasons. On one hand, it's a 17-to-1 brew ratio, which is pretty standard. The other nice thing about that is because coffee grounds retain about 2 grams of water for each gram of coffee, what we're gonna end up with is a pretty round 300 grams of brewed coffee at the end. So right now, as we look at our brew temperature, we're sitting at 188 degrees. So that's almost 20 degrees cooler than the water that we poured in there. Part of that is evaporative loss, convective loss, and then some of that is just going into the filter cone itself. And as it continues to draw down, we see that slurry continuing to decrease in temperature. So we're now down to right at 180 degrees. So when we think about what temperature we want to brew at, we have to be cognizant of all the other ways that we are removing heat from it. Now what we should expect to see as we compare this with a really preheated cone, we would expect to see more extraction in the hot one, because every 10 degrees or so of a hotter brew temperature doubles the rate of extraction. And we've also tasted this just kind of qualitatively. We know it tastes a little bit different when we brew one way versus the other. But we're gonna prove it today with TDS measurement, total dissolved solids. So our brew's complete right at 2 minutes and 45 seconds. We'll toss the filter, and an important step here that you wouldn't normally do, we're gonna make sure we know exactly how much brewed beverage weight we have. So we're pouring it into a vessel. It's got to be big enough for us to be able to stir it. We want to really agitate this and make sure we get all the little bits out. So we're expecting this to be right around 300 grams of beverage weight. So what we're sitting at here is 292 grams of beverage weight. And that's important to remember as we do our calculations. So we're going to reset here. We're going to use a really nice piping hot filter cone, and we're going to brew a second time. And we're going to see what our slurry temperature is during that second brew. Remember, this time it was anywhere between 180 and 188 degrees. See how that changes. And then we'll do total dissolved solid readings on both of them and find out where we end up. Hey y'all, we're all reset here. And what we're gonna do this time is we're gonna really preheat this ceramic filter cone before we brew into it. So that first time we just poured a little bit. This time we are just gonna really, really preheat it. Again, we're using that same 206 degree water, and we're gonna try to get this filter cone as close to that 206 degrees as we possibly can. And that way, we're gonna increase the slurry temperature and in theory, increase extraction. But we'll find out when we read the TDS, whether that actually happens or not. So this is almost too hot to touch, and we're gonna add a little bit more just for good measure. All right, so now we've got a really nice hot filter cone. very thoroughly rinsed filter. We're gonna, again, add the same 20 grams of ground Brazil. So same coffee, ground exactly the same way, on the same grinder, at the same temperature, keeping every single variable constant with the exception of the filter cone temperature. Right at 20 grams again, and we're gonna brew it in the exact same way. One of the important things to really think about with this is what we expect to see today is a higher total extraction rate from these coffees at a higher temperature. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a better cup of coffee. There's definitely a cliff you can fall off of where if you over extract the coffee, it just ends up not being very tasty at all. So you're gonna have to experiment with this either way and make sure that you're getting not just the higher extraction, but the right level of extraction for you. Some of the ways that you can troubleshoot that, if your extraction ends up being too high, you get that bitter astringent taste, that dry mouthfeel. What you can do is grind a little bit coarser. Conversely, if it's still a little bit sour, you haven't hit that point yet, keep grinding finer until you get there. Again, we're gonna do that same 340 gram dilution. There we go, 340 grams, and we'll check the temperature of the slurry again. So right off the bat, we're over 190 degrees and climbing here. So we're at 192 degrees in the slurry at the beginning here, compared to that 188 the first time we brewed it. And we should see that higher temperature increase the entire way through the brew process. A lot of the temperature loss that we're going to get through this one is just going to be the convective cooling, the interaction between the slurry and the air, but we're going to have a lot less temperature loss into the filter cone. So we're now at 185 degrees versus about 180 degrees. So the whole time we've been about 5 degrees hotter during this brew, which means that we would expect to see a lot more extraction the second time around. And we'll check the total dissolved solids that make it in there and calculate the extraction yield in just a minute. No matter what you do, one of the most important things is trying to get the most even extraction you can. That's what's going to make a cup taste really good and bring out the best that a coffee has to offer, rather than just being that kind of muddled, confusing flavor of, yeah, this is coffee. So here we are again, right at 245. We're done with the brew. And just like we did the first time, we want to know exactly what our beverage weight was. We're expecting it to be close to 300. The first time we ended up at 292 grams. This time we're at 295 grams. So a little bit of difference there, and that can be for any number of reasons. We're going to pull some of the coffee out of there with a filtered syringe, just like the first time, and we'll let it cool off and we'll check the TDS. Hey y'all, Alan back with you to just kind of recap where we are right now. We have our coffee that we brewed into this vessel, made sure that we had some agitation to it, and then we took a standard syringe, we attached a VST filter to it, and then we use that to draw up some of that brewed coffee and then set it aside. We then did the same thing with the hotter brewed coffee. New syringe, new filter, a little extra agitation again. Draw the coffee liquids up in and remove the filter. And then we let those cool. So what we have here is our VST coffee refractometer. And what this does is it bounces light off the sample that we put in there. And the way that that light gets reflected or bent tells the refractometer how many solids, how much coffee is in the liquid that we put on there. We're going to use the refractometer to test our first sample, the cooler one. Just a couple drops on the lens is all we need. We get 1.2%. Now we'll use the refractometer to test our second sample, the hotter brewed one. And what we get is 1.25, higher than we got with the first sample. All right, so what did we find out today? Well, we found out that the extraction rate really does change with temperature, which is what we kind of intuitively knew. But how much did it matter? So the total dissolved solids that we ended up with between the cooler and the hotter brew sounds like a small number, 1.2% versus 1.25%. But when we do the math and find out what our extraction actually was, our extraction rate in the cooler brew was about 17.5%, and in the hotter brew was 18.5%. And that's a pretty significant difference. And that's what we're actually tasting in the cup. Granted, we're outside, we're in Savannah, there's humidity to consider. We didn't brew them simultaneously. There are a lot of factors that go into this, but This is a window into putting numbers to the things that we kind of know intuitively or that we think the science tells us. And we look forward to bringing you a whole lot more of PERC Does Science and putting numbers to the things that we think we taste. Stay tuned for all the great stuff that we've got coming your way. PERC Does Science. PERC Does Coffee. PERC Does Science. PERC Does Coffee. PERC Does Science. PERC Does Coffee. Science? Which dissolved solids are those?